Good evening, everybody. I am Sam Blake. I'm the founder of Murder One and the author of The Dark Room. You can just see behind me there. And we're thrilled this year to be working with Laoghaire-Rathdown libraries and specifically the Lexicon to bring you Murder in the Library. This year, we can't be in the library itself, but we can bring you some fascinating discussions right to your screen. And this evening, I am delighted to welcome Professor Jim Fraser and Professor Dr Marie Cassidy, two of the most interesting and expert criminal investigators in their fields. Jim's a forensics expert who's been involved in hundreds of murder investigations as an expert witness and as a cold case reviewer. And he's the author of Murder Under the Microscope, which is a fascinating read and I cannot recommend highly enough. So do make sure you have a copy of that and you're ordering it as a result of this, I hope, or maybe you've got one in front of you. Dr Marie Cassidy was Ireland's state pathologist from 2004 until 2018. And during that time, she was involved in a whole plethora of very high profile cases. And her memoir, Beyond the Tape, she literally takes us into that world of forensic pathology and shares her remarkable personal journey. And again, it's another book which is absolutely enthralling. So I would highly recommend that too. As you're going to discover, our experts have Scotland in common and much more besides. Dr. Cassidy, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I don't know if it's justified or not, but we're delighted to come and speak to you today, myself and Jim. Jim suggested that perhaps we start off by introducing exactly who we are and what we do. Now, I do apologise because I've noticed immediately from talking to Jim that I have now developed a very strong Scottish accent, which I've been trying to dispel for years. But unfortunately, as soon as I speak to somebody Scottish, I slip back into it. So we'll probably have subtitles when this comes out. We're both two very different people, and we do very different things that are involved in murder investigation. I'm a forensic pathologist. And basically what that means is that I'm the one who turns up at the scene, has a look at the body, gets it whipped back to the mortuary, cuts it open, has a look inside, determines what the cause of death is, wash my hands and get the hell out of there. Jim's very different because he's got a very different aspect on the murder investigation. Over to you, Jim. What do you do?
Thanks, Marie. So my job, for about half of my career, I was lab-based. So I was a forensic biologist. So I dealt with cases like assaults, rapes, murders, and I received the items taken from the crime scene, analysed. So I looked at clothing and weapons, stains from the scene, did DNA analysis, fibre analysis, semen analysis, and then wrote reports and appeared in court as an expert witness. I did also go to crime scenes, probably nothing like as much as Marie did, but when I did go to crime scenes, I was usually there to look at something like blood patterns, or occasionally to discuss issues with a pathologist about, the situation the body was in, and or there was a dispute about the events, not the cause of death, but what had actually happened at the crime scene.
I mean, one of the things people always ask me is, why did I want to be a forensic pathologist? And, you go through the usual, well, I started off in medicine, then I decided that I didn't really fit in there, and I went into pathology because we weren't dealing with live patients. And then I suddenly opened this door. It was a bit like, going through the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, opened up this door, went through into this magical world of the city mortuary in Glasgow, which you've been in yourself at some point, Jim, and it's a very, very straight. It was in those days a very Victorian style building, and the fittings and the fixtures were very Victorian style as well. But it was a marvellous place, and that's what opened my eyes to forensic pathology. And I was hooked from day one. But that was me coming in 1985. I came into it. Now, at that time, the role model in the media, as we all get our information from somewhere else, and certainly there was nobody in my family had as much as not even a medical degree, but very few of us had been to the doctors, except my dad, who was never out the bloody place. So the only thing I had in terms of reference was Quincy. And this was, you know, any of you watched these shows in the 70s and the 80s will know what I'm talking about. You know, the forensic pathologist, American forensic pathologist who was involved in investigation and got himself into all sorts of scrapes. But going back to when you came in the 70s, the end of the 70s, I mean, forensic science, what is it?
Well,
what was it?
Yeah.
How did you get there?
How did I get? Well, I got there. If we go back to the 70s, I think people in the UK anyway, post-Brexit, are beginning to remember what the 70s were like. So from my recollection, this might not be completely accurate, but from my recollection, this was the only job I was ever offered. So I ended up in forensic science by complete accident. I only knew two things when I finished university. I studied biochemistry and clinical chemistry. I knew two things. One, I wanted a job. Two, I wanted it somewhere else. I applied for jobs all around the world. I ended up, like many, many Scots, in London. And you're right, it's the 70s, and I don't know how popular the programme was in Ireland, but certainly there's a programme in the UK called Life on Mars, which is about a kind of imaginary about a cop who from 2000 who's kind of transporting back to the 70s.
That's right.
Well, that is pretty much what it was like. It was if you worked in London, it was all about lags and blags and slags and shooters. And in those days, people actually, a lot of the cases I dealt with, in those days, people actually stole money, you know, real money, you know, money you could pick up. They went to banks and they kind of pointed shotguns at them and they had masks on. And they were often the kind of cases I was involved in because they were actually really difficult cases and the evidence was very strongly challenged because these guys were career criminals. Nobody steals real money anymore. People steal digits. You know, it's a very different kind of business. So the crime trends have changed a lot, but people still kill one another regularly enough, and the mechanisms by which they do that are pretty much the same as they were in the 70s.
I know.
Yeah, although they vary from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, as you point out in your book, Marie. There's far more knife crime in Glasgow, or at least there used to be.
Yeah.
Post the violence reduction programme, I actually think, in terms of some of those issues, Scotland is certainly leading in the UK and probably leading in, compared to many other countries in the world. It's been quite an impressive programme, albeit it's taken 10 to 15 years to get results.
To the 90s when they were trying to ban people carrying knives in Glasgow, remember them? And then they said, you know, if it was anything more than 3 inches, and I was saying, Jesus, with 3 inches of a blade stuck in you, you can still kill somebody, you know?
Yeah.
You know,
I also,
it's just
I mean, I also, the other thing that I also write these kind of very light-hearted pieces, which are my kind of premise is I'm going to write stories that are true, but they're so bizarre, I would never put them in a book. And I keep meaning to write one about knife crime. Because what people don't realize is that, I mean, I could almost describe, with my eyes closed, the kind of standard knife that I encountered, not necessarily in homicide, but, you know, the kind of kitchen devil with a kind of 100 centimetre long blade, 15 millimetres wide. You know, people don't realize that it's not exotica that are kind of injuring people and killing them. It's just pull out your kitchen drawer. That's the weapon, you know. And I've examined thousands of these things. I mean, literally, you know, I would get them out of the bag. I would draw a diagram. I would look for blood. I would find blood. We would get a profile. I mean, in the opening of my book, and this genuinely happened to me. There's no fiction in my book. I remembered a conversation I had with another scientist across a bench. So imagine two people sitting with white coats on, white bench. We're both using microscopes. And I said, "What are you working on?" "Oh, I'm working on a murder." You know, interesting. She said, "No, not really. Just the usual stuff. You know, guy stabbed somebody else. He died. Got the victim's blood on the knife. Suspect denies it, but we've got his fingerprints on the knife. Usual murder." No, I said I don't want people to get, think we're getting too callous. Read Marie's book; it's not a callous book, not remotely. It comes out very clear what Marie thinks about what it's like to be involved in these things. But it's hard not to see these things as routine, because you're doing them every day of the week, but that's not what most people encounter, obviously.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think people realise that most of the cases we deal with are pretty straightforward. There's no finesse. I mean, your normal murderer, leaves a trail behind him that, you wouldn't need to be a forensic scientist to follow, really.
No.
And thank God, most of them are. But it's just a very small percentage of the cases that require a lot more investigation. But come back to when you were in the 70s. I mean, what was in your toolkit going back to the 70s, early 80s? We didn't have DNA then. So you were relying very much on what the sort of the run-of-the-mill stuff that people now would just go, we wouldn't bother with that.
No, blood grouping, fibres, hairs, shoe marks, kind of stuff like that. Semen, you couldn't. Not only could you, even with in all the sexual offences cases, the success rate even with grouping was terrible. So most of the time you were there simply establishing that some kind of sexual activity had taken place, but the kind of smart offender would just say, well, it was consensual, and then the argument would be about something different. So the science was largely irrelevant. I mean, I did a session with students just at the beginning of the week, and I tried to get the point across to them, because my take on this is exactly the same as yours, Marie. In most cases, we don't play a huge role when it comes to court. Sometimes we do, and sometimes it's really tough. But actually, I think that the science, that you can comment on the pathology, the science plays a much bigger part in the investigation of the case. And it's, so you determine the cause of death. Well, that's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. If you say this is an accident, that's the end of it. This is just bad luck, or somebody's got this, somebody's died of a heart attack, that's the end of it. And if you get that wrong, then that has big consequences. And the same thing with, in some instances, I've been to crime scenes and I've looked at the blood pattern. And sometimes you can get some cops have different attitudes. Even the same cop can have different attitudes depending on presumably what the workload is at the time. And sometimes you get to a crime scene and you get a very clear kind of sense that they're kind of really not hugely interested in this until you turn around and say, no, this is really deeply suspicious. This is not somebody who's just fallen down a set of stairs. You've got a blood pattern in one room and a different blood pattern in another room. You've got two separate incidents. So even if this is suspicious, even if in the end it might have been an accidental death, or a death that can be explained in another way. The fact that you've got two fights starting in two different rooms, and again you have that difficult conversation which happens even now. Again, you allude to it in your book, Marie, where you have to say to a cop, I know this is what you don't want to hear, but I'm telling you, you need to get some troops in here and do some serious work and talk to these people and find out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found that there's been a reluctance to involve the forensic scientists. And I've been a great believer, having come from the Glasgow situation, where if they thought there was needed a forensic scientist, you were there at 3:00 in the morning, or whatever time it was that the body was found. Yeah. And half the time you'd been in, the forensic scientists, and they'd been in and gone by the time I even arrived. And I was used to that kind of a service. And when I arrived in Ireland, it was a kind of, oh, no, we'll be fine, we'll manage ourselves. And I'd go, really? Yeah, I did a course. I did a 2-day course. And No, these guys have done more than a course, a 2-day, a weekend in Durham or whatever it is. I said, these guys, they're trained in this. But that's that. So you do get these people who just don't want to I think they just want to hold on to it. They don't want to let anybody else in, and it's crazy.
It's kind of professional anxiety, and also that you had a complication. There's another person at the scene, and you might say something they don't really want to hear. I have to say that's moved on a lot. The situation in Scotland's changed dramatically. The situation in England's changed dramatically for the worse, frankly, because of such. I did some research recently where I was genuinely shocked, and I'm not that easily shocked about. I've worked with the police and I've worked in this world a long time, so I've seen lots of things. So we interviewed lots of cops and scientists. This was a kind of ethnographic research project where we did hundreds of hours of interviews. We were saying, how do you find this? How does it work? Talk about this case. We thought it was all about homicide. They weren't all murders, but they were all homicides. I was genuinely shocked about some shootings where my default position is shooting, you want at the scene, firearms expert and a pathologist. You might want a blood pattern expert. And you want them all there at the same time because they're all going to have slightly different takes on this. You're talking about firing positions. You're talking about the final position the body's in. The blood patterns may or may not add something else. And the scientist was saying to me, I can't get it. He said, I've emailed senior investigating officers, and I can. He didn't show me the emails, but he said, I've emailed some people 6, 7, 8 times. I'm a firearms expert. I wasn't at the scene. The pathologist may or may not have been at the scene, and now they're asking me to reconstruct it, and I can't do it. And I can do it if I get the photographs and I get the pathology statement and I get these other statements, but I haven't even got these yet, so I can't really do anything. So I don't know what I'm doing. I've established that this was the gun that fired the bullet, or this bullet came from the gun that the police have seized, but I can't reconstruct the scene until I get the information. And I know you can do it after the fact. I have done some interpretations from photographs, but no, you really want to be there, and you want to talk to the other experts, and you also want to talk to the investigator and see what they think about it, so that everybody leaves there with a shared understanding of what they think happened and what they're all going to do next. And now, as you will know, that can sometimes change on the basis of subsequent investigations that you might do in microscopy and in pathology, or what might happen in some DNA analysis or fingerprints or whatever. So nothing's ever fixed, but you really need that conversation, which it happens less and less these days.
Well, I was blessed in Ireland because the ballistics experts were the police, the Gardaí.
Yeah,
it wasn't part of the forensic science lab. So we always had a ballistics expert, because I used to always say, why have we got ballistics experts? Somebody been shot, somebody's lying in a pool of blood with a knife sticking out their chest, and I'd go, am I missing something? They go, no, they always come along. You never know, they'll come in handy. They're all big fellas, they can lift. So horses for courses. It just depends on what the system is. And as I say, luckily, and it was lucky actually, because I came from the Scottish system where we had a wee sort of flurry. Remember the Arthur Thompson days when we had guns suddenly appeared on the scene, and we were all going, "Oh, this is really interesting. This is so different." And then we moved over to Ireland, and shootings are 10 a penny. And I was thinking, God, this place is pretty violent. I thought I was coming over into semi-retirement into Ireland, and no, because so easy to get hold of guns, and every farmer's got a shotgun propped up against the back door. Not supposed to be; they're supposed to be in a cabinet, but hey ho. So you see, so people were used to guns, and a lot of the guards shot, and they knew what they were. So they handled guns themselves outside of their profession, legitimately. So they were well versed in shooting incidents, whereas somebody who works in ballistics somewhere else maybe doesn't get that. As you say, they're not allowed to come into the scene. They're not given all of this information, which it's I always think we should all be working together. It's a team effort.
It's just professional, as I said, kind of anxiety. It's wholly wrong. I think it's much less likely these days because I think, God forbid, the kind of CSI effect that people are. I'm not saying people are more knowledgeable because of CSI because they're not, but they're kind of more aware. And I think a lot of people now are because they can be challenged in court. Well, why didn't you call this person? They're a bit more risk averse. I think it is worth making the point again, Marie, that it doesn't always yield anything. It doesn't always give you the answer, but it does close a door. It does answer a question. It's like you go looking for someone else's blood, you don't find it. Well, at least it's not there. That doesn't mean it was a meaningless exercise. It's presented you with a different problem. There isn't somebody else's blood there, so you need other lines of inquiry to make sense of this death. If it's a murder.
Yeah, I mean, because when you're in some of the cases you're mentioning in your book, when you go and review the evidence, there wasn't evidence to support. And a lot of the time it comes down to people's perception of going back to the old thing, every contact leaves a trace, which you said is very simplistic. But I think maybe going back to the 80s and the 90s, it was, and things were that simplistic, I think. And I think it's only now that things have got much more complex. And so particularly when you brought DNA into the mix, things became, this is our new tool, and it's changing the face of forensic science.
Yeah,
I mean,
Well, of course, it was the kind of the golden answer, wasn't it? It was the answer to everything until everybody realised. Well, except most scientists were aware it wasn't the answer to everything. Most pathologists would have been aware. In fact, there was a whole period there was a whole number of years somewhere between, I don't know, probably up to the early 90s, where you just think, if somebody asked me to do DNA again, I'm gonna strangle them. It's just that is not. But have you done DNA? And you say, but what's DNA got to do with it? It's just a kind of one trick answer. But of course, now the situation is that DNA is so sensitive that it's most of the work to do with DNA is to try and prevent contamination, and it still doesn't necessarily get the answer to the case. Although in some instances it can produce some extraordinarily useful evidence. But it just moves the debate on, doesn't it? So if you take it in, if we talk about sexual crime, for example, all DNA. I don't mean to diminish, 40 years of really quite sophisticated technology, but it's done two things. When you've got stranger offences, when you actually don't know who the attacker is, and that's particularly relevant maybe in serial offences, then it is fantastic, of course, at linking cases and identifying offenders and eliminating people when you suspect them, husbands, partners, other people who pop up who might have a history of sexual offending. So it's fantastic for that. But in terms of what it's done in court, when you identify someone, all it's done in a certain sense is shift the debate on to consent. So now what most people are, like most murders, most people are sexually attacked by people they know. The identity is not in question, 90-odd%. So the argument is different. The DNA just confirms there has been some kind of sexual activity, and that's the end of it. Of course, in murders, it tells you something slightly different because you know that there might be a sexual element to the murder, or at least you know that somebody has been connected to the dead person around the time of their death, and that may or may not be relevant. It gives you a line of inquiry, doesn't it? It gives you somebody to eliminate it, and of course, it's good at finding ménage à trois and people who are over the side and things like that. Again, you give a few examples in your book, Marie, where there was a third party hovering in the background which nobody knew about. And all of a sudden you get a DNA mixture, and you think, that's interesting. Who's this person?
Exactly.
It's good for that.
I know. Yeah, because in one of my cases in the book I was talking about was exhuming bodies to see if we could identify them, and I knew that we were going to. But they were going to go down the road of mitochondrial DNA, And I was just thinking, well, fingers crossed that somebody's not going to come out with a real shocker here saying, you know, Willie down the street, well, actually, he's actually your brother. I said, this could open up a can of worms, and the coroner was going, no, don't mention these things. I said, okay, we'll just see what comes out of it.
It's a huge can of worms, isn't it? Because there's the kind of general estimate is that, you know, 10% of the children in the world are not the genetic offspring of the parents who they believe to be their parents, you know. And of course, DNA can highlight those things, you know, that, which is why when you're doing a mass screen, of course, or if you've got familial DNA, it's got to be done really kind of sensitively, you know, because you can identify relationships or eliminate relationships that are present but are not genetically based, despite what everybody believes.
I know I had an interesting case where a young lad was a homicide stroke accidental death, whatever, depending on who you believe. But part of the evidence was that there was semen found somewhere and was DNA done on it. And the forensic scientists who had originally given the report had come up and said that it's a 1 in 10, 100,000 million or whatever, these fantastic numbers you come up with. I keep on saying, how do you get these numbers? There's not even that many bloody people in the world.
It's only a probability, remember, Marie. It's not.
way above my grade. And then, so they were going, oh, this is great because this is what we've got. So now we've got, you know, the police are running with this. This is all based on this being something else. And then all of a sudden, they told the scientists, well, actually, there's, you know, more men in that house. You know, there's other siblings, and and then suddenly he went, oh, hang on a minute then, and rode back then on his millions and millions come down to
the minute you've got a relationship, it just plummets. You know, it can go from billions to tens of thousands. The minute you've got a relative involved.
And the police couldn't understand that. They kept on saying, well, this is just ridiculous. I thought, well, if you'd given the man the proper information in the first instance, then
absolutely. Absolutely, and that's the point. That's the point about the reconstruction I was talking about as well. You know, if you give somebody the right information, if you think, you know, there's relatives involved, it's a completely different question. Because, as you will know, or if you've read any of the reports, it always says, first it talks about likelihoods, and it talks about a person chosen, you know, at random in the population. And of course, this is the classic mistake that Sir Roy Meadows made, wasn't it, in the kind of infamous caught deaths cases? So you've got two children in a family. I mean, even I spotted that then. There's two children in a family. He multiplied and he said two unrelated deaths. And I'm thinking, how can this is two siblings? These are not independent events.
Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
You know, and so you can't possibly use these probabilities. That's a completely different statistical model. And you know, and I find it difficult to imagine somebody with his kind of background couldn't have known that. But you know, we all make mistakes. That just happened to be a big one.
But it's like tossing a coin, heads or tails. And just because it was heads the last time doesn't mean to say it's going to be tails this time. It's the same probability. It's 1 in 2. And he just, I found that absolutely amazing that a man that obviously been in and out of courts, given evidence in God knows how many hundreds of cases, should suddenly get simple maths so badly wrong. And so, to the extent that, you know, what was a terrible tragedy in a family suddenly became, you know, a serial killer in the family, you know. It just becomes awful.
But don't you think that's, I mean, there's a number of things operating there. Don't you think, I think there's a couple of things going on. I'd love to hear your views. Firstly, Meadows, and I don't know the man, and I don't want to sound as if I'm condemning him. I'm not. Meadows for me was at the end of the line of what I call the great man pathologist. You know, the kind of who kind of, and I don't know if he actually was, but that's the kind of view I kind of formed from a distance. You know, I've worked with lots of pathologists, and you'll probably know every one of them. And some of them were very considered, you know, like yourself, and they listened and they reflected, and not slow to tell you, you know, that, well, this is my view and this is the basis, and let's try and resolve this. Others I found, and this goes with scientists as well, of course, it's not just pathologists, that they had this view, and I wasn't awful sure where this view came from, and I couldn't see an awful lot of evidence for it. Well, I sort of thought, well, okay, well, you're a pathologist and I'm not, so I can't assume that I know what you're talking about. But then I got really worried when they couldn't quite explain to me, because I don't think I'm stupid, you know. So why is it you think this has happened? So that kind of, I haven't met any pathologists recently who are like that. But the other thing that I think was operating in the Meadows case, and this is supposition in my part, it's just kind of informed guesswork, is that sometimes the whole process of, you know, discussing things with counsel can the prosecution can push the expert. A lot of people, when I'm teaching people who are expert witnesses, I warn them, just because you give evidence during the prosecution case, you're always independent. You're a witness in the court. Don't think you're only going to have trouble with the defence, because often I've had to reel the prosecution in and say, no, that isn't what I mean here. What I mean is this. You know, I know what you would like it to mean, but that's not what it means. And I suspect that Meadows got caught in that trap, that they told him how important his evidence was, and it somehow just kind of, the stone was rolling down the hill, or the snowball was kind of rolling, and it picked up, and he got caught, and we've all been there, just maybe not so spectacularly badly. And I can tell you, I've been caught out, you know, a few times. You just need to be really careful in court, and really clear.
Yeah, but I think early in your career, you're not quite sure where the line is.
No, absolutely. No.
And you do find that you're kind of a sort of lumped in with all of the, you know, the witnesses for the prosecution, and so it tends to put a bit of a burden on you to come up and say, well, excuse me, but I also agree with that guy over there that's asking all the nasty questions, the defence.
Yeah,
and people
absolutely
don't like that. Yeah. And I think that was one of the things that I tried to always try and steer that road. But sometimes it was very, as you say, it was very, very difficult, because I would have thought that probably in the 80s and the 90s, the prosecution weren't even that sure about an expert witness, and they didn't really understand that, no, we're there for the court, not for you. It just so happens that you were the one that called me. But my evidence should just sit right in the middle.
Yeah. I mean, my take on this now, having had years to reflect on it, is that they know what the law is for the most part. I mean, I know I've definitely been in courts where not only was I confident the advocates weren't sure of the law or were disregarding it, but so was the judge. I mean, I've given expert evidence in areas where I'm not an expert, and that is just verboten. It's just not allowed. And yet there I was in the High Court in Edinburgh, giving evidence, and I'm looking at the judge, and he's looking at me, and he's not in the least bit bothered. It's just all too inconvenient for them, you know. And I had to kind of at one point just say, no, you need to stop there. But I think they just get carried. It's either a matter of convenience, or they just get carried away with the whole business of advocacy, and that's the kind of crucial. That's the crucial line between us and them. They are there to argue a case. We are not. We might be there to argue an opinion, but that is an opinion that we've formed as independently as we can, on the basis of evidence, and on the basis of considering a range of possibilities. Again, I'm sure you'll agree, Marie, that there's never. Well, it's very, very rare that you get a case where you think that's the only possible explanation here. There's always another. There's always another couple of, but you know, so the classic line in court is always, well, you say the explanation for this blood pattern is this, and that would always be couched in a probability of some kind. I don't mean a number, a kind of likelihood. You know, yeah, this is, and you always leave a little gap, even when you're very confident, you always leave a little gap because you just don't quite know how it's going to go. But is it consistent with this? Well, it's consistent with about a dozen other things. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm telling you, this is by miles the most likely explanation. This guy's had his head smashed in, to the point where, it's sort of like, no, it's not. You can't say this. No, it's not a self-defense because basically he's been hit about a dozen times. Now, I would never name the number. You might give the number because you would look at the injuries. But I would always say repeatedly in the position in which he was found. In other words, no, he didn't get up and fight back because he was unconscious, and your man kept hitting him when he was unconscious. So, but it's all kind of put over in coded language, isn't it? Whereas hopefully you come along and say, I don't know, there was 8 skull fractures. So yeah, that's how many times he hit him, at least.
And that's the at least is always the
because I always say, because could it be only one blow? And I say no, because it takes at least one blow for blood to flow. So that if blood is spattered, there has to be another blow, so. But I wanted a case, not a big case, and I've never written about this in Linlithgow Sheriff Court, and it was a fight, and it was a kicking. And it was the best kind of example I'd seen of a kicking pattern on a shoe. And you need 2 things basically. You need a contact mark where you can see something wet with blood is touched, and then you need to see kind of radial splashes coming away from that. In other words, there's been the shoe has hit something wet and the blood is splashing out from it. And you don't always get both of those things, and you don't always get them at the same time. So you're always kind of like, could be, likely, all the. And I had said, by far the most likely explanation for this is he's kicked somebody, and I knew whose blood it was, so that was it. He's kicked this person. And this, I now realise, relatively inexperienced lawyer, as I say, we're talking about Linlithgow Sheriff Court here. And he said, well, could it be this? And I said, well, no, I don't think that's very likely. And could it be this? And I said, well, no, I don't think that's very likely either. We went through about 5 or 6 explanations. And he said, well, can you think of any other explanation than the one you've given? And I thought, now, that's the question you should never have asked me, because I said, no. And I looked at him, and I saw in that split second that he'd realised what he'd asked me. And he just said, no further questions. And I thought to myself, yeah, you should have said that before the last question you asked me.
I know.
I mean, you don't get that in the High Court or the Crown Court because they're much more skilled and they know. And sometimes you go in expecting a pasting and they don't ask you any questions because they know basically you're going to do them more harm than good, aren't you? You're just going to reinforce something. They don't want the jury to hear you saying it because it's just going to damn their client. Not again. Yeah, I mean, they've had it. It read out by prosecution counsel. Exactly, they don't want you to say it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I always think that the good ones are the ones who know when to sit down and shut up. When they start asking questions, and I think you're making a big mistake here. Just as you said, I'm just going to be spouting the same old thing. Yeah, he had 4 skull fractures. He had a big bleeding. That I'm going. They've already heard that. Now they're hearing it again. And there's only one person in here that we're all pointing to, and it's that wee guy sitting over there. We're clients, but hey ho.
It's wee mental Willie in the dock. who's got form as long as your arm, but nobody's revealed that yet, but the jury have already guessed it.
Half the time when I look over at them, I think, what a pathetic wee soul. You think, how could this person have done that?
That is the classic Hannah Arendt, the kind of philosopher who got panned for this phrase when she sat in during the Eichmann trial. So Eichmann was abducted by an extraordinary rendition by the Israelis and tried for war crimes. And she sat through it and she'd come up with this phrase, the banality of evil, which she was then panned for because they never quite understood that what you and I have obviously seen, which is that some of these people, when you look at them, you think, are you the guy? You're the guy that did this? You just look as if you're like some, punter who's just doing his shopping in Asda. You don't look like this evil sod who's tortured somebody and then and then killed him. It's just there's too many stereotypes in the media that everybody who kills is some kind of evil machine. Most people are killed by somebody who actually live in the same house as them.
Yeah, and it just goes wrong, badly wrong one day, and that's the way things happen. I mean, I think some of the cases you spoke about in your book were bringing in, the psychological profiling, and I sometimes wonder if that's the same kind of a thing. It does more harm than good in some cases, because people then get tunnel vision because they're then looking for this particular character that somebody's described, and that can be so dangerous.
Yeah, one particular case, which the Rachel O'Kell case, which obviously I won't go into any detail, but it went just dreadfully badly wrong. I think people are much more circumspect now. In the 90s, there was following that, and certainly into 2000. I think what investigators now do is they seek what I think is called behavioural advice. They don't ask profilers, if you've got a real whodunit and it's something at the crime scene or something from the pathology tells you that this is a serious kind of deliberate killing. When you've got people who've been, say, tortured and or they call it instrumental violence. Again, you'll have seen this even more than I have, Marie, where it doesn't take much to kill somebody with a knife. One stab can do it. Yeah. It's not difficult. My experience was typically a couple of stabs, but when you see 50 stab wounds, that's a different story there. So either it's somebody caught up in a highly emotional event that led to the killing, or it's somebody who just likes to kill people. And if it's somebody who likes to kill people and you haven't caught them yet, you can see why the police get a bit worried about it. And some of these behavioural profilers are really interesting to talk to, because they just add a bit of depth. And as long as you just, as you say, you don't get caught up in tunnel vision, and that's part of the investigation, along with all the other things, eliminating relatives, eliminating local sexual offenders, and you don't just think it's this kind of crazy killer out there, which it might be. That's the problem. You don't know yet. Yeah. So as long as you keep it in balance, I think people are a bit more balanced these days.
Because one of the first cases I came across when I came to Ireland, I hadn't even started working there. I would come over just to do a recce and see the place, and I got whisked away from the airport because Jack Harbison, who was then the state pathologist, hadn't turned up to pick me up, but there was two guards waiting for me, and they said, "Oh, Professor Harbison's at a scene and he's asked if we would bring you out."
Oh yeah, you give that account. Yeah.
But the problem was, because you couldn't make some of these stories up that you and I have been involved in. But anyway, when I got to the scene, it was classic, the forensic scientists squabbling over who takes precedent. Was it the blood pattern? Was it this? Was it that? And I thought, I'm not getting involved. I've come back in Glasgow, not getting involved here. I don't even know who any of you are. But the problem was, because it was an unusual case, it was double murder. It was there was some sexual element to it, and there was a bit of mutilation. This was something that was way out of their ken. And I think that was why they then decided to go down the road of the profiling. And that gave them some idea of the type of person it could be. But when they released this to the public, somebody came forward and said, "Oh, yes, I recognise." And there was a man hanging about. And then all of a sudden, she described it. And all of a sudden, then they had a picture now of this person, and that was released. And then they all homed in on the wrong man, who was a guy. And he then, sort of confessed. We'll not talk about confessions, but he confessed. He had nothing to do with it at all. And then just a couple of months later, there was another double murder down the country somewhere else, and that led them to the real killer. And then, and this happened, this was now going back to 97. And in 2015, the Forensic Science Lab managed to get a profile that exonerated the first boy, who was now dead. He died of a heroin overdose. And the other boy was already in prison anyway for the other two. So, people again think that all the investigations that you do, in particular with your reviews, it's done in, CSI time. Do it in an hour.
Yeah.
It takes weeks, months, sometimes years to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah, and we started off talking about, how the public kind of get confused about the difference between our roles. But the other thing I think the public often, I think deep down they must know, but I don't think they grasp just how much detail and effort needs to go into this. How this, I mean, when you're examining a body and you see it, you're documenting not just the fatal wound, every wound, every bruise, because as you say quite rightly, it's the pattern of injuries, and very often it's the minor injuries that help you reconstruct things, and it's the same. It's the same for me when I'm looking at blood patterns, for example. It's not, you see a pattern, but to a certain extent, you're not that interested in the pattern because you've got a body lying there and you know what the pattern is. You're looking for blood that doesn't fit in with the pattern because that might be blood from the person who committed the crime, So, and the amount, and it just, here's something you can try at home, folks. Don't use blood, use red dye, make a pattern and try and draw it. And you imagine yourself standing at a crime scene trying to draw that. A photograph's no good. You can't do it. You can't photograph a whole blood pattern because if you photograph it from far back, you don't pick up the small spots. If you photograph it from too close in, you don't see the big spots. You don't see the whole pattern. And it's a really, so you've got to draw it. And you try drawing a blood pattern, it takes a long time in the same way as, documenting injuries. And that's before you even open the body up. God's sake, that's just the exterior, isn't it? The detail, hours and hours and hours, just to then be able to safely say this is the cause of death, and this is what I think were the kind of things that happened just before it. These little injuries to the knuckles or the knees, or they are connected with it. And then you get the witness statements, and it all starts to make some kind of sense. It's a slow process, and it's slow because you just don't want to get it wrong, do you? You really don't want to get it wrong, even if you correct it later.
I know. Once it's there, it's there.
Once it's out the bag, it's just gonna. You're going to be confronted with it in court. Well, and that's what you're saying now, doctor or professor. That's what you're saying now. But actually, this report here says something different. Oh, yeah, cheers. I really need reminding of that. Just read that out, could you, for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury? Yeah, great. So. I mean, I remember one instance, because fortunately, I'm not aware I've made that many mistakes, and certainly not that many I've been confronted with. So after this, I won't get into the details of it, but I did make a mistake and I had misidentified a fibre. I quickly corrected it. Fibre was, it was important evidence. It wasn't crucial, but it was important. And so I go through all this. We go through all these charades and all the rest of it, and then eventually, after all sorts of various bits of cross-examination, the defence counsel says, "Well, can I just take you to page 4 of your report? You look at this item, and the fourth, could you just read that sentence out plainly?" And I'm thinking, well, that's the only, as they say in Ireland, fecking sentence that I don't want to read out in the report, because that's the one that's wrong. And then, so you really don't want to get it wrong. That's why you need to pay a lot of attention.
But it must be quite frustrating because, particularly working in Ireland with the guards, and as I say, it was very, very rare. We got a forensic scientist at the scene. They just did, it was, a sweep. They just collected everything up, and then we'd go up to forensic science lab and just go, boom, there you go. Have a look at all of that.
Fill your boots. Yeah.
Really? You need to give somebody some guidance. And that's why I often wonder why. I mean, I know that because I used to always be banging on about the case conference and say, well, there's no point in just having the guards at the case conference. You need to have other people there, because it's like Chinese whispers. I said, this is what I found, and I've relayed that to the as chief inspector, whoever it was at the mortuary. The time it gets back to the Garda office, it's changed slightly. And then they go to the conference, and then they add a wee bit in because somebody else has said something. They think, well, did she say that, or did somebody else say? Anyway, we'll just, and all of a sudden,
we'll just say that anyway.
Exactly.
I tell you, I'll give you an example of that, a pathology example, which is quite amusing, where I overstepped my mark, accidentally just got. So I was flying up to Glasgow to meet an old colleague of yours, Peter Venesis, about a case that he had examined sometime in I think I might have been still at school when he did this case in Kent. So I was working for Kent Police, and I was flying up with a senior investigating officer who was now running the new cold case review unit. And he says, "Will you come with me, because we've got this big long statement from Peter Venesis." And I think I was just there to, I don't know, just as a bit of kind of support. I don't know that I can't remember that there was any particular reason why I was there. And we were driving round to Gatwick, and I said to him, "Well, what was the weapon?" And he said, "Oh, I'll show you because he was driving. I'll show you the photographs what the weapon was." So we got on the plane, and of course we're sitting together. And it wasn't a busy plane, and he kind of got the book of photographs out, and he got this. And he showed me this photograph, and I said straight away, I said, "Well, that isn't the weapon." And then he said, "Really?" And I went, "Oh, sorry, I did forget it. Listen, it's nothing to do with me. Forget it, Peter Venesis will tell you whether it's a weapon or not." And he kind of looked at me. And it was because I would normally never do something like that, but because it was, we were on a plane, we'd been sitting chatting, I knew him well, it wasn't a live scene, and my kind of guard just dropped slightly. And of course, we got up to Glasgow, and we sat down with Peter, and we went through his statement page by page, and after we were with him for a couple of hours, and about halfway through that, he got this book of photographs out, and he said that this was quite interesting. He kind of turned it around and pushed over. And he says, "This is what some people think the weapon is." So he obviously, and Peter just looked at it straight away and said, "Well, that isn't a weapon." And I thought, and of course, but what's really interesting about it was not that I stupidly expressed a view that I probably I shouldn't have. I certainly would never have said it in any formal sort of stuff. It was because I was just talking to this guy. And the bottom line is, this woman had horrific head injuries. I mean, just terrible. Yeah. And it was just got a little branch. And I just, and he said to me the way back, he said, "How did you know that wasn't the weapon?" I said, "It just didn't have the mass. It just wasn't heavy enough." There's no way on earth that's going to have caused those. And Peter just said straight away, "Well, that isn't the weapon."
That's not it.
The really interesting thing about that is that for 20 odd years, everybody in that investigation team had believed that was the weapon until that moment in that review. God. That's what people believed was the weapon. Now, don't ask me what the weapon was. I don't remember the rest of the discussion. But there, 20 years of what I call an embedded hypothesis is something that just somehow got cemented in everybody's mind, and just got stuck. And I've seen quite a few cases like that in the States where, it seems to happen more with pathology evidence than scientific evidence. I don't know quite. That's not a criticism of pathologists. It's a people not listening carefully, or pathologists not, as you say, not getting invited to the meeting. In fact, in the case I'm thinking about in the States, when we said to the pathologist, he says, "I'm sick telling them that." He said, "I've told them 4 or 5 times that the woman can't have been killed there. She can't possibly have been, strangled on that surface. She was supposed to be suffocated on a hard surface. No, she's been suffocated on a soft surface. So the body's been killed somewhere else and dumped." He said, "I'm fed up telling them." So these things happen. This is why cases need to be reviewed.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Because people do think that there's a lot of science behind it, but I think your book in particular says that the science is there, and when the science is used and the science is useful, then that's great. But there's an awful lot of human input, and I think it's the human input is where things can go drastically wrong. It's the human factor which usually determines whether a case is solved or unsolved, not the science. Exactly. Anyway, I think maybe Sam's got a couple of questions for us.
Do your worst, Sam.
This has been so interesting, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating to hear you talk together as well, because you've just got so many things in common. And I would urge people to buy both books, because they give you really a clear sign of both sides. So Beyond the Tape and Murder Under the Microscope. But yeah, one of the questions that came in, and I suppose this is a question for each of you, is what cases did you find most challenging, or what was there one case that you found really, really challenging? Mari, do you want to go first?
The ones I find more challenging, are the ones where it's not that straightforward. I mean, as we said earlier on, the majority of the cases that we deal with are what they are. You know, you've got a phone call coming in saying somebody's been found, in O'Connell Street, and he's been stabbed. Yeah, he's been stabbed, and I'm just stating the bleeding obvious, as I normally do. But then you get cases where you've got, head injuries, which, is it an accident? Is it, a homicide? And those are the ones that I find, intriguing. What is this? We don't really always have an answer. So there's not really, I mean, people ask me this all the time. What's the most interesting case? Every single case is interesting, because you just don't know what you're walking into. Right. When I leave the house, I don't know. I mean, I remember being a junior doctor, and we'd get a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. Will you come up and see Mrs. McMillan? She's got a sore head. Can you prescribe paracetamol? I'd go, oh, Christ almighty. At least when somebody phones me and said, we'll get something at 3 o'clock in the morning, I go, well, that must be something really interesting. and every case is interesting, and for different reasons. Sometimes it's because of the pathology. Sometimes it's because of the circumstances. Sometimes it's because of the people who all turn up to do it. And I find I'm always trying to learn from people. So that's why I love experts. I love bringing in all the other people and saying, I know somebody who might know something about this. I know nothing about it. I've heard that this is really, this is the end thing. My danger is always that I do get kind of caught up with people who, are touting for business sometimes, and they've got the latest thing, and I think, oh, well, it must be something. I must be marvelous, because I know nothing. And I'm always worried that I get involved in this, not fake science, but maybe something that's maybe not being tried and tested too much. But no, as I say, every case is interesting, and I just can't sort it out. I just it's like picking my favourite child. Well, I'll tell you which one it is. He's not here, but it's difficult to say which case was the best case, because they're all fantastic.
And they're all different, aren't they? All challenging. I mean, and particularly the ones in your book are all incredibly challenging. It's interesting. Yeah. Is that the same for you, Jim? Because it literally, you don't know when you're going out to a scene. I think that's the joy.
No, and often the cases, a case that can be routine can then suddenly become a difficulty in court.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, just give it a short answer, it depends what you mean by difficult. If you mean difficult, you get scientifically difficult cases, which are, it's difficult to come to a judgment, and then difficult to then write a report, that explains this, and then difficult to explain that in the witness box, especially if the evidence is important and somebody wants to argue with you. And then you also get cases occasionally in Marie, this comes across in Marie's book, certainly in some of the cases that kind of affect you personally a bit. Now that's pretty rare for me, but in the Robert Black case, who, a serial child killer, so he was killing children that were the same age as my children. And not only was he killing them, he was killing them in horrific circumstances. But the worst bit for me was that this was not a kind of monster coming out in the dark. This guy was snatching children off the street in broad daylight. That is, you sort of think, that could be. So I remember sort of thinking, well, I tell you what I'm going to do. I was at the briefing and I'm thinking, right, so when this is finished, I'm going to get in the car, I'm going to drive home, I'm going to get my 2 children, I'm going to lock them in the house, and they're not going to get out. And that's but I mean, that's not a common feeling. It really isn't. But that case, I remember thinking, this is really horrible. This is not nice. Yeah. Most of the time, it's not so difficult to stay further back than that.
Detached from the situation. Yeah, I think, Mari, you've said in your book as well, and in the TV program as well about the having to deal with the relatives brings you very close in, doesn't it?
Yeah,
To a situation, and so it's slightly different. I suppose that's the difference between distance. Whereas Jim, you're dealing.
I don't. It's only very occasionally I would have to do something like that, and I remember turning up at a few crime scenes that didn't involve deaths, and some of the people who were victims, and I found that really difficult. I thought I don't want this, And again, Marie's very eloquent about the difficulty of talking to relatives and how you have to learn that as a junior doctor and then progress. And I suspect, I heard an interesting piece about that in the radio recently, and I can't imagine that ever gets easy. I imagine you get better at it. I can't imagine it ever gets easy. Not if you're human, anyway. Not unless you're a psychopath. So.
I might not pass that test, I must admit.
No, I haven't read your book. I reckon I can say as a non-expert, you're not a psychopath.
That's good enough for me.
Yeah, I've worked with some psychopaths. I know what they are.
Brilliant. Absolutely, you both have.
Can I chip something in before you ask another question? Because I meant to say this. I think you should have a different title for your book, Marie. I think you should have called it Backwards in Heels, which I would have thought, which was the quote from what's her name, Ginger Rogers. I thought that would have been a fantastic book. A life in forensic pathology, Backwards in Heels.
Goodness. It's very interesting what you say when you're talking about people having the wrong perception of how things are investigated and how fast things are. And I think it might be us, the crime fiction writers, who are at fault there, because when you're writing a story and you've got this timeline that you need to fit everything into, the fact that it can take weeks and months to do investigations it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
It's very difficult. Yeah. So we have to, we do artificially construct situations. But certainly in your book, Jim, when you were talking about, now I've forgotten which case it was, I should have written all this down. There was one of the cases you were talking about where there was a very, very detailed analysis. And I think you had 3,500 different things to look at. It was when you were. I think
that was the Robert Black case. It was fibers. I mean, it was just an absolutely immense. I mean, there was 5 years between the beginning of that case and me giving evidence in court, and I worked on it for 5 years. The first year was full on. After that, it was much quieter. But I never, and it was just immense. Also, there was another case a bit like that, which was the double murder in Kent, the Russell family. But again, that was. I mean, I worked on that literally from the moment I set foot almost in Kent Police. I think it was the first. It was within 3 months of me going there. I was still working on that the year I left. Like 9 years later, I was. I mean, somebody's been convicted, but it's a very contested conviction. Some cases just never really go away.
Yeah. They stay there for a long, long, long time. Was the Robert Black case the one where the policeman caught him in the end?
Yes. It was the police officer found his own daughter in the van.
That's right.
So she survived. She was abducted. That's how he was caught.
Yeah. I mean, whenever you say that to people, I read that in your book, and I was just like, we make things up in crime fiction. Honestly, the truth is often stranger, isn't it? I mean, that just.
Well, the thing about the truth is it doesn't have to be credible, does it? You have to be credible. The truth doesn't have to be credible because you just think, I don't believe that, but it's true. It's just, I would never have believed such a thing. And you really would struggle to make. If you made that up, I can imagine an editor saying, you can't put that in.
That's ridiculous.
that isn't going to work. It's not going to work.
I know. Yeah.
Incredible, absolutely incredible. Mara, you must have had cases like that where just things that just came out of left field. Is there anything you can think of that just astounded you when you got into the detail?
It's more when I get to court, I'm sometimes astounded because information comes out that nobody had bothered to tell me, and you're sort of standing there and I can remember one time going back to the forensic science, and we'd gone through my report, and it was a woman that had been found dead, and the husband was on trial, and then the defence barrister got up and said, "Now, Dr. Cassidy, were you aware that there was DNA found under her fingernails that didn't match the husband?" And I went, "No." And he just went, "No further questions." And I went out and I went, "What was that all about?" He went, the guy said, "It was her own DNA they found under her nails, nobody else's." And I went, "Swines."
I had one experience like that. I had an experience like that as well, where I hadn't been told the nickname of the dead man. And apparently he was known only by his nickname, but in the police file, that the papers that had his real name. And everybody involved in it was from Vietnam. So all the names are very difficult anyway, which was maybe partly why he had this. So his nickname was Singapore Billy, for whatever reason. And this barrister said to me, and as a consequence, following up several other questions, he said, "Well, what about Singapore Billy?" And I said, "Singapore Billy?" And he said, "What about Singapore Billy?" I said, "I'm sorry, I'm not sure who Singapore Billy is." And then I got attacked because you don't know who Singapore Billy is. No, I feckin' don't. Who is he? Nobody told me, and this became a huge. This was kind of thrown back in my face. What?
God, it's absolutely fascinating. I think we're going to have to reconvene this conversation, and we're going to have to do this again, because it's so interesting. We've got a lot of writers watching as well, and there are nuggets of gold in everything you said all the way along the line. For anybody who's trying to construct a plot or trying to come up with a twist on a story, because as you say, truth is often stranger than fiction. This has been mesmerising. I want to take you two out to dinner, and I think it's going to be, we'll just have the best evening ever. It's great to chat. So thank you so much for joining us at Murder One, and thank you, and again, huge thanks to DLR Libraries for being able to, for enabling us to be able to put this programme together. For our audience, do make sure that you join us for Liz Nugent and Val McDermott, and we've got Declan Burke talking to Joanne Harris coming up as well. And we've also got an incredible programme of masterclasses for those writers among you. So check out murderone.ie for details. But thank you so much, Dr. Marie Cassidy, Professor Jim Fraser. Thank you so much for this evening. It has been absolutely fascinating. And I hope, I was going to say, wish you both a safe trip back, but obviously we're already there. So the joy of Zoom, beaming into people's living rooms. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.